Hi, in this session, we will continue talking about render setup. But in this session, we will talk more about the render quality and we will talk about the render engine, which is V-Ray. In the first session, we talked about the common parameters, how we can set a single frame render or a time segment render if I want to render one single frame or an animation. Definitely, we have to set our resolution, how many pixels in the width and how many pixels in the height. And we set the file, where do you want to save the file and what is the format. And we did a small render as an animation, and I named it in here to be as a .move render. Now, the second thing we're going to talk about is we're going to go into the quality of the render and how V-Ray works. So I'm going to go to the V-Ray tab, and I'm just going to go through the basics and the most important thing to set your render. First of all, we have to talk about the image sampler. The image sampler or the anti-aliasing is basically we have two types of the sampler. We have a bucket and we have a progressive. We're going to talk about both. First of all, what is the image sampler or the anti-aliasing? Technically, when we render, sometimes the image sampler is responsible for two things. The first is a noise, if the render has noise to it. And the second thing is whenever we have curves, if the curve is going to be smooth or jagged. The more samples we have in the image sampler, the more smooth it's gonna have, the render is gonna be, and at the same time, no noise will be detected. So we have two options: the bucket and the progressive. So I'm gonna start with the progressive, which is the easiest. The progressive render usually it renders the whole scene. For example, I'm just gonna go for a render now. Okay, I'm setting for an animation. I'm going to just put single. I'm just going to make don't save the file. So I'm going to render. As you can see, it's going to render the whole image. And I can see the progress in here. It's going to render the whole image. And then it's going to make it as progressive. So it's going to get better and better and better. It's going to get clearer and the noise will be less and less. The more we give it time, the better it's going to be. While if we go to the bucket, in here, it's going to be a different render. So it's going to render the same thing. The start is going to be the same. So building light cache and so on. I can just lower these down. I will talk in those in a second. So I'm just going to lower to have a fast render for now. Okay. So as you can see, it's going to do the building light cache. And then it's going to do the pre-passes. This is level 2. And then the level 3, it's going to be the render set, the render. So after this, you will see it's going to start rendering. And this is the final result. As if I go to the progressive and set a render, you will see it will render the same thing. The first step is going to be the same. So it's going to build light cache. And then it's going to do the pre-passes, which are the indirect lighting we're going to talk in a minute. And after the pre-passes, 1 and 2, there's 2 pre-passes. So we have to wait for this and the second pre-pass. And after that, it will start rendering, and the render is going to be in a different way. As you can see, now the render is going to be completed, and we're going to have passes. The more passes we're going to have, the more details we're going to add, the less noise we're going to see, and the better quality. So now this is pass 1, and now it's going to start pass 2 and 3 and 4, and it's going to go. The more passes it's going to get, the better quality it's going to be, cleaning up all the noises. You can see here there's noise. So if we wait a bit, you will see that these noises are going to get less and less and less. The more time we give it, the better it's going to be. So as you can see, now it's still noisy and there's still details in here. So it's going to become better and better and better. This is the progressive render. Definitely we have to give it a lot of time. This render to be good quality, it's going to take around 30 minutes. So definitely we're not going to wait for that. So this is the difference between progressive and bucket. So if you go progressive or bucket, the second thing you go inside the image sampler. The progressive image sampler, or if you go to the bucket, it's going to become the bucket image sampler. The progressive image sampler, it has the minimum subdivision and the maximum subdivision. Usually I keep these as they are because they are very good. So 1 and 100, they're very good, very low number and very high number for the maximum. But the thing is in here, the render time, it's in minutes. If you put 0, it means take as much as you want to make it the best option possible. Then if you can change in here, you can put 1, for example, and then this render should be finished around 1 minute. If you put 5, it's going to be like around 5 minutes. What's going to do? It's going to do the render until the passes reaches 5 minutes, they will stop. If they are past 25, then they stop on the past 25. If they are past 200 and it's reached 5 minutes or 10 minutes, whatever minutes you're putting, they will stop. So this is a good thing for like samples if you're doing test renders and so on. So you don't want the render to take a lot of time. But when you want to be high res and final, definitely we have to put it as 0. The second thing is basically noise threshold. If you put this as 0, then it's gonna take this noise threshold to be the noise reduction. The least number you're gonna have, the better quality. Usually 0.005 is the number I use for high-res renders, and it's more than enough. And if you want, you can definitely go a bit higher. The higher the number, the more noises we're going to introduce. You're going to see more noise. So here it depends on your render. If your render looks good on 0.01, then leave it 0.01. Don't add more detail to it so that your eye won't see them, but the computer will see them. It means more render time. So it depends what you're going to be working. If you want to limit this with the number of time, then I'm going to put, let's say, 10 minutes. And it's going to do the best to finish everything in 10 minutes. So that would be a limitation for that. This is in terms of progressive. In terms of bucket, definitely it works almost in the same thing. So the more samples or more division we're going to add, the better quality. So the anti-aliasing will be better, so smoothing and the noise will be better. But at the same time, usually we have 1 and 4, but I think it's by default it comes 124. So you can put 124. Usually in my case, I start with 1.4 as low res, and when I want to do test renders, and when I want to go high res, I would go usually 12, sometimes 16, but very rarely go to 24. If you need to go 24, then you can go. And the noise threshold in here is basically the same thing. Okay. So usually, if I want to go low res, if I'm working with progressive, I would do the following. So I put in here 3 minutes or 2 minutes. Noise threshold will be 0.01 or 0.005. And that's my render setup. If I'm doing high res, I will put this to 0, okay? And I will render this as high res. If I'm rendering with per bucket, the only thing that's the better bucket than progressive, it needs less RAM. So if your computer, it doesn't have not much RAMs in it, so maybe less than 8 gigs of RAM in your computer or laptop, so maybe bucket is better. Progressive takes a bit more RAM. But still, most of the computers that have at least 8, if they're new, at least 8 gigs of RAM. So if I'm going low res, I would go 1.3 or 1.4 and 0.01 or 0.05, doesn't matter. And high res, usually I would go 1.12. Usually the most of the renders I would go 1.12, sometimes 1.16, but it depends on the situation of the scene and how detailed you have and so on. So this is basically the image sampler and bucket sampler. They are mainly the most important thing to give you the quality of the render. So they give you the smoothness of the render, not having jagged curves. And the other thing is having noise in the scene, yes or no. Now, I'm just going to go to GI. GI is global illumination, or it's basically indirect lighting. By default, it goes brute force and light cache. And I think one of the best situation. What does indirect illumination means? It means the light, when it goes in, it bounces in the light, in the scene. So if I'm going to turn off indirect lighting, I'm just going to do a quick render. As you can see, everything is going to look really, really different. And you can see that it's rendering now. And you will see that the scene is so super dark. I'm just going to wait for it till it finishes, and then we talk about it. Okay, as you can see, we have only the direct light in here. So I can see the lights coming from the ceiling. I can see the indirect light coming up. I can see definitely the other lights that are going in the scene. What about the indirect lighting is basically when the light comes in, it's going to bounce in and bounce back to fill the scene with the light. So this is basically indirect lighting. There is two engines in V-Ray. There's the primary engine and there's the secondary engine. If I enable this and I do the quick render, you would see definitely everything is going to be lit because of the bouncing of light, which is super important. I'm just going to cancel this. So the primary engine is responsible for the first bounce. The secondary engine is responsible for the other bounces. So second bounce until the last bounce. So the light is going to come from, let's say, this spot. It's going to come down. It's going to bounce here, take the colors and bounce here, and then bounce here, and then bounce back. And there are millions and millions of photons going around the scene to make it lit. So these are the engines. So by default, primary engine is a brute force, which I would advise you to have. And you can use, I used to work with radiance map. Then I realized that brute force is better because it gives us more details. So I work with brute force as a primary engine and secondary engine as a light cache. Brute force is linked with the progressive render, which is great with the bouncing. And then the light cache, you can just play around with the subdivisions. Usually I put 100 for low res if I want something to be quick and gathered like really fast. And you can as 1,000 or 1,500 for high res. You can go more, but usually I don't, but it depends on your case. So this is basically the light cache and the brute force for the indirect lighting. Nothing much to worry about, but it's important to have it on all the time because most of the time we need indirect lighting to have more realistic lighting. Now, the third thing I'm going to talk about is go to the render setup, and usually when I render, I have the denoiser on. V-Ray denoiser is really interesting. It will help make the noise, we get rid of the noise. So if my scene is still having some kind of noise, usually V-Ray denoiser will clean it up and make it better. I have this on for most of the time. You can just put it on and delete it and see the difference. How we can go here? I just go to render element and I just go add. So I'm going to delete this. I'm going to add, and there's a lot of things we can add from render elements. Definitely, we're going to be talking about those in later courses because they are really important, especially if you want to export each pass by itself and then composite them in After Effects or Photoshop to get better. And even now in V-Ray, the new V-Ray Hotfix 2, you can also composite them and work with the lighting and the light mix inside of V-Ray Frame Buffer. So in here, you can just choose V-Ray Denoiser, and that's it. When you render, it will do the denoising for you and it work it out with all the settings you have. So this is basically the presets for render setup. I'm just going to set a render for now. So I'm going to put single frame. I'm just going to render it, I would say 1500 pixels by 1060. Okay, and I'm going to save it as just a JPEG image. So I'm just going to go files. I'm going to go JPEG. Okay, I'm going to save it on the desktop and going to make quality best. I'm going to go to V-Ray tab. I'm going to set it 1 to 12 with, let's say, I'm going to make it progressive. So I'm going to set it to 0. Okay, and at the same time, I'm going to go GI. I'm going to go light cache. I'm going to leave this at 1000 and brute force. So that's perfect. And then render element, I'm just going to have a denoiser. And that's it. And I'm going to render and I'm going to wait for the final result and I'll show you the final render. Okay, after waiting for a while, you can see the passes in here. It's like around 115,000 pass and still going. Still have just a few of them, but I'm just gonna stop the render. The good thing about progressive render is that you can stop the render anytime and it still keeps the image as is. As while you're rendering you're rendering bucket and you decided to stop it, because it's rendering part of it, so half of it will be, let's say, good, or maybe all of it except for this area will not be done. As for the progressive, you can just stop anytime. The more passes you give it, the better quality it's gonna get. So I'm gonna just stop this render, and now now it's doing the denoising, and done. Okay, so now this render is done. As you can see, it's a good quality render. There's no noise, nothing visible. The quality is good. Everything is good. So this is a good render to start with. Definitely, we're talking about basic rendering, and everything concerning this course is an introduction to V-Ray, an introduction to 3D Max in general. This is basically everything concerning renders.